Okay, everybody, welcome to our last session of the book. As a reminder, next week we have Gabriel Tupanamba joining, which I'm personally very excited about because I think he's going to offer two talks. There'll be like a week pause in between them, but it's going to be based on his new book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis, which I had the pleasure of reading and commenting on a lot. And so what he's up to there is so much, and it's so rich, and it's a kind of excavation of the Lacanian field in ways that exceed, I think, a lot of what we're accustomed to in contemporary Lacanian studies, which is largely kind of commentary. He's trying to maybe reinvent the wheel in some ways. And it's a very ambitious project, but it's a very good one. So that'll be really fun. He's going to send readings out. I'll send them to you tomorrow for prep for next week for his talk. Obviously, he's aware that we're studying BPP, so he'll hopefully link some of his stuff to the text, because as you gathered, these last two sections, especially the one before the conclusion, is kind of the densest, the thickest section, right? So we could spend hours dissecting it line by line, I feel. So my objective tonight is to sort of do that to a limited degree, to sort of go through the text and flag key things that I've noticed, and then you guys can jump in as well. Then when we're done with that, I have some presentation to give on the problem of time and repetition from Catherine Malabou's work and also from Lowe's. Both kind of arrive at similar problematics about the issue of time and the issue of repetition, although Deleuze's is much more unique to his own project. It's much more kind of Kantian. But so I have some things to say about that, but that's the general trajectory. But let me start by just a little bit of a recap from last time. So from last time, you know, we sort of want to stress a couple of key themes that are that we flagged and that we identified and so on. The first is that Freud is basically making the argument that repetition compulsion is what links the drives, and that the before of the repetition compulsion is also the beyond, right? And that this is the speculative linkage both to dream work, but also to the play of children, and is found in traumatic neuroses. And I think we know that very, very well by now. We also know that there's a distinction that Freud makes between primary binding and secondary. Well, precisely, primary is freely moving excitation. It's actually a primary process and a secondary process. So a primary process is excitation which is not in a bound state, and secondary is precisely in a bound state. And the key point is that the pleasure principle asserts itself only after binding has occurred. So we immediately see that there is a problem with unbound energy or with unbound excitation, right? And we can see also why, for folks like Wilhelm Reich, this notion of unbound energy becomes something that can be mystically taken up, and he sort of follows that direction. Anyways, whether that's successful or not is for you to decide. If it can cure you from cancer and you get on the organ machine, who's to say? But unsuccessful binding is important for psychoanalysis because it leads to, or is analogous to, traumatic neuroses. We also saw a point that I find of interest, which is that Freud recognizes the demonic character of drives that are in opposition to the pleasure principle. So while there is a speculative beyond of the pleasure principle, I think it's fair to say that Freud is not comfortable in this space, right? It is a space which he needs a lot of support from anything from the Nirvana principle to Schopenhauer to Kant, right? He needs a lot of help from outside of what science is capable of commenting on. He also calls this, these drives, which are in opposition to the pleasure principle, demonic. And demonic is a pure figure of drive detached from sexual drives. So we also saw, and this is very important, that he ends section 5 with the characterization of what he calls the universal character of drives. And the first one is apropos what Malibu will say in her distinction between elasticity and plasticity. We have to understand that the drive in its movement for the restoration of a quote unquote earlier state is an elastic, organic elasticity, right? That urge is composed, its form is precisely formless. It is elastic. Malibu will question the efficacy of thinking drive, whether it be death drive or life drive, as a form of elasticity, and will point out that when we conceive of the drives in such a fashion, what we abandon is precisely a type of negativity, right? Because we no longer think the drives dialectically, I would say, right? So it becomes an almost materialist point that she wishes to raise. And she's clearly a partisan, or very much in favor of positing the drives vis-a-vis plasticity. And we're going to get into what that means a little bit later. Related to this organic elasticity is also the point that there's something about the elasticity of drives which is also conservative. So I think that's important to sort of note. And I think that that conservative nature is a commentary on the status of matter as such. Now, here I wish to raise a book called The Trouble with Pleasure by Aaron Schuster, where he makes the very nice claim that, okay, organic elasticity, whatever you want to call it, or Freud's theory of matter, is what he calls a thesis of sick matter, right? So that what Freud discovers in the beyond is something about the nature of matter which is sick, possesses a sickness which insists, persists, but it insists on all matter of the life drives, right? So there is a kind of point at which, by the time the death drive is actually introduced, Freud introduces it not as necessarily something which is autonomous in separation from the life drives, right? But as something which is inextricably bound up with it. And I think that's very, very significant and very important. You see, the point is that he almost performs, through positing the death drive as an organic elasticity, he almost makes the concept an autoimmune concept, like a point of impossibility, right? So those are some opening points I wish to say. And of course, he also makes the point that the life drives are the sex drives. We can think of these two synonymously, right? And that what governs the repetition compulsion is both the point of the beyond, the fort, right? The kind of transcendental, the X, as much as it is also determined by the repression of the sex drives as well, right? Which is why for the psychoanalytic method and orientation, infantile neuroses and the revisitation of childhood is so significant as it pertains to the location of the symptom. So he thinks them as a dualism, Yet there is a lingering question as to whether that dualism can be thought dialectically. And I want to talk about that's kind of like a theme that I wish to raise. The other theme I want to talk about later after we look at the text is basically what Deleuze will say about the tripartite before, during, and after of Freud's theory of time. Okay. So, okay, that's my agenda. Let me open up the PDF. And if there's any questions at this point, please feel free to jump in. Okay. Hello to everyone that's joined, and hello, Raphael. Hello, how are you? It's nice to see everybody. Here we go. Okay. So let's do this work of kind of going through so we have a greater mastery of the text. I feel like, you know, this whole process of reading this text, it's so funny to see sort of philosophers and psychoanalysts comment on Beyond the Pleasure Principle because they're so polarized by it. For Deleuze, it is one of the finest pieces of speculative philosophy ever written, right? For someone like Ernest Jones, it's like a total, like, circular logic, almost like nonsensical presentation, right? And we talked before about the way that it polarized the psychoanalytic community upon its publication, but I was very struck, especially in the section we're going to look at right now, not so much at circular logic, but at the kind of novelty of Freud's development of the argument. Because in some ways, there are points of contradiction that come up, and I think we can kind of try to locate them. However, it is a beautiful sequential development of an argument, which I think I've mentioned this in prior sessions, but I don't know about you, but how often do you encounter books quite like this? You know, like as a form of writing. I don't see this kind of originality on display. Maybe I'm too nostalgic or conservative, but I wonder if you agree. I find it very very refreshing in that sense. But also, like, he doesn't need, when he's making his arguments, when he's making his points, he doesn't need to elaborate or extensively footnote. He is still keeping it at a level of speculation, right? Of metapsychology, right? So there's kind of a both and. There's this both rigor and originality, but also lack of rigor that kind of plays a part. Okay. So here he begins with a sort of analysis of a bit of a kind of prehistory around how he had thought of drives up into this point, up into this discovery point of the text, right? And he introduces a few new kind of points, concepts, terms, and he makes a pivot to a question of the organism and the cellular level, right? And he's leaning on several figures from biology, Weissman, number one, Ehring, number two, and Fliess, number three, are the sort of interlocutors that he's tethering with in this opening section of the text. And in general, you know, what he finds interesting about the biological research of his time is the proposal that a merging or a conjugation of cells possesses an internal dualism for which there is inherent in cellular life a kind of touch of the immortal, or a touch of the eternal, or something which is kind of like Gumby, like we think of elasticity, and we think of like popular culture. I don't know if you guys remember the cartoon figure Gumby. Maybe you're too, I don't know your ages exactly, but it's this kind of like figure who can survive any ordeal, but doesn't exactly take on the form of the other, retains its own shape, yet can kind of bend to anything, yet still retain a kind of inner integrity. And I get this sense when Freud is discussing the insights of the two biologists that he's analyzing, of where he's deriving this kind of very interesting idea. So let's sort of isolate a couple of these examples. The first is with Fliess. Now, Fliess is a kind of obviously early interlocutor of Freud, going back to the hysteria studies. And here he's putting forward a thesis of the status of drives as based around a kind of primary lifespan of a period of time, periodicity, and so on. And Freud is, in part because of his realization and analysis of the repetition compulsion, is recognizing that there exists something which defies this static conception. So he adopts what he calls the dynamic. And then he introduces this figure of Weissman. He says, it was Weissman who proposed the distinction in living substance between mortal and immortal halves. The mortal half is the body, in the narrow sense, the soma, which alone is subject to natural death. The gametes, by contrast, are potentially immortal. Under certain favorable conditions, they can develop into a new individual or surround themselves with a new soma. So perhaps somebody with more cellular biological knowledge than myself could help us understand this. I can only give a fairly cursory description of what this means, but I'll pause, and if anyone wants to jump in with a little bit more on this notion, I think that would be great. He says it's a morphological conception of cellular life, of biological life. Yeah, please.
I mean, like, I think that he's sort of linking, like, I think the biological move is like masking a metaphysical one, right? Like this split where he's basically saying that these gametes are potentially immortal. I think the keyword is really potentially for me when I read that. Like I can't help but think of like Aristotle, because like Aristotle is all about potentiality. And so he's like, you know, I think he's just saying that it's almost a theory of like essences. Like he's positing that there's this like immortal essence, and it's like, I don't know. I'm kind of just like spitballing here of like association, yeah. But
no, I think that it's actually Freud is making the point that this theory of Weissman's is thought as a kind of speculative biological proposal, insofar as it's not necessarily a philosophical or metaphysical claim that's being made here, as far as I can tell. It's rather that how do we account for the reproduction of life, and not necessarily through Darwinian lens, because later Darwin will come up, but then be easily rejected, right, as a sort of highly inadequate account as to why the pleasure principle regulates, right? And we'll get to that in a moment. But I think here, there is a kind of mystical biological thesis being presented that internal to cellular life, its condition of reproduction, also contains germplasm, which is immortal, basically, right? Otherwise, how would you have the generation of life or something like this?
Yeah.
That's my reading of it.
So in section 5, he stresses the fact that the gametes retain the original structure of the living substance, and laden with inherited and newly acquired drive inclinations, they undergo development, etc., separate themselves from the organism. But he lays that stress again on this maintenance of an original structure that can then undergo its own development. Yeah. I think he's also he's drawn on like Lamarckian biology, correct?
Yeah, right. Right, which I don't know too much about, so I can't say too much. But remember also that part of what animates Freud's thesis is this notion here of this goes back to the ethical point we've made several times now about fatalism, right? Which is there a type of fatalism of death that is that each life dies its own death? Like in other words, to say that philosophically, is there a kind of internal teleology of the lifespan of an organism or of life, right? And here he's addressing that here in this second highlighted passage. If death is a late acquisition of life forms, then there can be no death drives that originated with the beginning of life on Earth. Multicellular organisms may nevertheless die for internal reasons, inadequacies in their differentiations or imperfections, but this is not relevant for the problem concerning us. Such a conception of death and such a view of its origins surely accord much more closely with customary ways of thinking. So there's something about the death drive which exceeds this point. So he's sort of, but he's retaining the possibility of the eternality of the cellular conjunction or conjugation, right? Within life drive, right? Like life drives still, there's still a kind of homologous relationship that he wants to suggest, that he's willing to adopt from this wider theory, right? So he moves on and concludes by saying, here is what we can accept from Weissman's project. First, if the microorganisms are able to merge as a pair before showing any modification due to aging, if they're able to conjugate, upon which they again separate after a certain time, they are spared from aging. They're rejuvenated. Conjugation is presumably the precursor of sexual reproduction in higher forms, but it still has no relation to propagation and is limited to the mixing of the substances of the two individuals. So he's basically saying that the concept of conjugation, and you know that the concept of conjugation or binding is paramount for Eros, which he will develop. So he's fully, I mean, I think if you want to just make a note of this genealogically in the intellectual ideas that's influencing Freud, that's where to locate that. And then also Freud's theory of, let's say, vitalism also is, he's retaining that here from this school of thought. And so this is interesting. So he was able to demonstrate convincingly that it is only the products of its own metabolism that lead to death in a certain generation of a given species. Left to itself, an infusorian dies a natural death due to imperfect elimination of its own metabolic products. But perhaps the cause of death in all the higher animals too is essentially the same inability. So he's sort of looking at, and this I would track from the last section with how Freud is distinguishing the animal drives from the human drives and the novelty of what he's realizing about the discovery of the death drive as that which makes the definition of human life and death fundamentally unique, is how I would basically summarize the significance of this conversation. So he says, even if the protista prove immortal in Weissman's sense, his assertion that death is a late acquisition applies only for the manifest expressions of death and does not render impossible any hypothesis about the processes pressing toward death. Our expectation that biology would deftly eliminate all evidence for the recognition of the death drives has not been fulfilled. The striking similarity between Weissman's distinction of soma and germplasm and our separation of death drives and life drive remains, and it retains its significance, right? So he's sort of, I don't know how you would characterize the value of putting this discourse of scientific knowledge into conversation. Derrida will, and other commentators will very much not be convinced of Freud's use of different discourses of science. They think that he's always doing it on the basis of a non-rigorous conversation or non-rigorous dialogue. And Lacan actually gives the example, he gives a kind of psychoanalytic reading of Freud. You'll remember later, Freud says, one way to describe the striving to return to a state of inactivity is to declare that tendency the Nirvana principle. And then he cites a woman by the name of Barbara Lowe. Remember that? Well, in Seminar 5, Lacan kind of says something quite mean to Freud, which is that, well, look, why would Freud cite this woman in this cockamamie notion of Nirvana principle? Well, I'm sorry, he says this in the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis under the transference section. And he says, part of it is you have to understand that Freud never had a love life other than his wife, and that he was a very monogamous and chaste Puritan when it came to how he saw women. It's a very bombastic point. But it was meant for Lacan to demonstrate how wrong or maybe how superficial Freud's analogy to the Nirvana principle is. So somebody's going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to, Jones refers to it as Freud's quote unquote uxorious nature.
Oh, interesting. So Lacan's not the only one that has.
Lacan cites this, but I think it's in the first few pages even of Jones's biography of Freud, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And yeah, Lacan similarly does take him to task in Seminar 5 for the Nirvana principle.
Okay, so here we're approaching the heart of the revelation of what will be the death drive and the kind of the strong claim about it. But he's not done yet with talking about these other discourses on science and so on. So Ehring's theory of processes of living substance posits that there's 2 types of processes constantly working in opposition. So you can see he's pulling from a kind of, he's really looking at science in a kind of modal sense. These are models for plausible relationality of phenomena that we're discovering as psychoanalysts, is how I would say it, right? So it's very schematic, right? I don't know if that's a positive or a negative. It's something. So he gets further proof of the notion of conjugation from Ehring, and then finally arrives at this point on Schopenhauer. I think that this is interesting because one of the things we know about Vienna of the time was that Schopenhauer was deeply in vogue, especially for younger people. He was sort of like the philosopher par excellence in some sense. Like there was commentary which said that every young intellectual at the cafe would always show off their reading of Schopenhauer to others as they walked by. So referencing Schopenhauer is a reference which would be very well known to people, in other words. I think much less so today. Let us boldly attempt to advance one step further. There is general consensus that the union of numerous cells into a vital association, as in multicellular organisms, has become a means for extending their life. One helps to preserve the life of the others, and a confederation of cells can live on if individual cells die. Thus, one might attempt to extend the libido theory gained through psychoanalysis to the relation of cells to one another, imagining that it is the life drives or sex drives active in each cell that takes the other cells as their objects. So what's happening here is he's coming full circle, and he's saying we have developed a theory of the libido, but the internal debates within the psychoanalytic community, and you'll see this as he goes on, about its status as a kind of biological substrate of form is in dispute, right? For Jung, it's sort of quite simple, and it's sort of grounded on a mythical substrate, and it is, you know, a kind of constant pulsional force, right? And I think in some sense Freud is wanting to obviously push back on that, which we'll see in a moment. But one of the first things to note is, and we've seen this before in this text, is that he's seeing that because the analysis of libido had certain shortcomings, namely that it tethered the wider logic of psychoanalysis to the ego and introjection of the libido, and the kind of origin point of libido was fully housed within the ego, right? He's seeing this as inadequate. And so one way to think about this distinction, if you want to think about it topographically, is that by positing the beyond of the pleasure principle, he's positing a terrain that is on the border of the ego, and which is an object, right? An object which is not as easily housing a kind of monistic conception of the libido, right? Okay, so here it is appropriate, he says, to review the gradual development of our libido theory. The analysis of the transference neuroses compelled us to adopt the opposition between sex drives toward the object and other drives described as ego drives. So he's obviously going to retain that distinction, right? But what we want to track is what is being added to that distinction. And I think in some ways one can read beyond the pleasure principle as maybe not that much is being added to it, yet that minimal difference of what he's adding to this distinction of the drives that he had developed before in libido theory makes a huge amount of difference, right? So you can read through all of this. So his point is, accordingly, the analysis of the psychoneuroses made a great step forward. Indeed, the concept of sexuality and therefore the sex drive had to be extended until it included much that could not be classified within the reproductive function. And then I've noted this passage is important because it shows one of the big changes in how the superego is constituted after. So one of the things he says was that the notion of the ego was fortified by a type of external repressive apparatus, right? And so, as I said before, and Karatani has indicated this to me, one of the insights of how repression now works, right, is that its logic is no longer as easily identifiable along a kind of social superegoic, right? So that was a sort of, if you like, a limitation of libido theory, is in the way in which it conceived of how repression from superego functions. That's how I read this section. I think that's worth flagging. What libido theory led to was the notion that the libido was housed within the ego and is fundamentally narcissistic. What does that mean? That means that the theory of the drives that it would derive follows a logic of a kind of internal narcissism of its own circuitous route to attaining, right? But this is not actually the case, right? The narcissistic libido theory does not adequately address the real stakes of the two primary drives, right? I think that's clear. And then he makes this move, and he says, because we've identified the beyond, we now can map this topographically. We can now map this topographically, which he's mentioned before. Please stop me at any point if there's any comments or interjections. We must now emphasize all the more the libidinal character of the self-preservation drives. We shall now be bold enough to take the further step of recognizing the sex drive as all-preserving eros, and of deriving the narcissistic libido of the ego from the contributions of libido the somatic cells use in clinging to one another. But now we suddenly face another question. So he's sort of saying we can retain that to some extent. But if the self-preservation drives too are of a libidinal nature, do there now remain non-libidinal drives? The demon. In any case, none can be seen. But then we will have to agree with those critics who suspected from the beginning that psychoanalysis explains everything through sexuality. Interesting. So, and then he moves on to make this point about Jung, which I think we're all familiar with. And he says, from the beginning, our conception has been dualistic and is today even more dualistic than before. And we suspect that in addition to the libidinal self-preservation drives, there are other drives active in the ego, and we should be able to point them out. And it remains unfortunate that analysis has thus far enabled us to demonstrate only libidinal drives. However, this should not lead us to conclude that others do not exist. So what's interesting here is that hasn't analysis also been able to demonstrate the drives that are connected to the repetition compulsion? So I'm curious as to why he says that that analysis hasn't been able to reveal that. So how shall we derive the death drive? And what's notable here, and this is why I wanted us to read on sadism and masochism, is what does he say when he first introduces the death drive? He calls it the sadistic drive, right? Almost like it's like synonymous with that, right? And I found that very interesting. And it invites us to analyze, well, what he will later write, I think 4 years after the publication of BPP, as the economic problem of masochism. But anyways, this is a very significant passage. I think we should pause with this for a moment. If only we could relate to these two polarities to each other and derive the one from the other, and this means love, hate, or life, death, right? These kind of general polarities. How do we, is the question, right? From the very beginning, we have recognized this sadistic component in the sex drive. As we know, it can make itself independent and, as a perversion, dominate all the sexual strivings of the individual. It also arises as the dominant component drive in the pregenital organizations. So, can we not now suppose that this sadism is actually a death drive which, through the influence of the narcissistic libido, was forced away from the ego such that it only appears in the context of an object? Interesting. So it now enters the service of the sexual function. So you see, it's almost like an intrusion onto the sex drive, which layers it in some sense. And I just find it interesting and kind of maybe overlooked that when he's really introducing this for the first time, really, he's making this direct linkage to sadism. And so when we get to Deleuze, I think this will become a lot more clear why that's the case. And then he goes on to say, wherever the original sadism experiences no moderation or admixture, the well-known ambivalence of love and hate in love life is restored. And so why is that the case? And I think that the answer is that the restoration that the sadistic drive gives or produces as a kind of precondition of that ambivalence, right, which is a kind of Freudian truth, if there ever was one, is dependent upon the death drive. So here he's making something more primary about the death drive. It's not just this kind of visitor that's unwelcome. It's constitutive now. It's constitutive of the whole theory of pleasure. And that fact that it's constitutive is going to be a huge debate as to whether there really is something beyond the pleasure principle, right? And most people say that there's not, in part because of the way in which he's integrating it into his system here. Now, if such a hypothesis may be permitted, we have now satisfied the demand for the demonstration of a death drive, albeit a misplaced one. Yet, this view is far from being easily comprehensible and makes a perfectly mystical impression. So let's note that notion of mystical impression and see if he actually gets around it. Flag this. When Malibu claims that a thinking of death drive as elasticity is problematic, I think one of the consequences of that problem is precisely that you retain a theory of the death drive as fundamentally mystical. Would be one way to think about it. So, i.e., does Freud get beyond myth or mystical conception of death drive is a question. Because as in a moment, you'll see that he very ambivalently will ground it on myth, okay? Any thoughts, please jump in. Yes.
I mean, I'm far from decided on the issue, but he does in the new introductory lectures refer to the drives as, quote, the myths of psychoanalysis. I mean, they are this thing that can only be reconstructed by a kind of speculative genealogy. I mean, it's, that's kind of, I don't know, the fixture, well, that's psychoanalysis. It is a speculative genealogy in essence.
Yeah, let's just pause that question on myth and we'll get to it very shortly. You can flag in the meantime this notion of masochism as a recoil of sadism back onto the ego, which is why sadomasochism is hyphenated, right? That's why there's a fundamental linkage there. So sadism would be like the unbound loosening of the impulse into drive. Masochism would be its glorious return, right? Which I think should make good sense to you, especially those of you that have read, like, you know, Lacan's Seminar on Ethics and Questions on Marquis de Sade and so on. Masochism, the drives turning against the individual ego, would then actually be a return to an earlier phase of the drive, a regression. That's super significant, right? So you see that he's doing something very interesting here, which is a tactic that he's done before from section 1 and 2, which is he's wanting to and extend a universalism of the human psychical condition beyond the couch, beyond the example he's not saying that this structure is only applicable to traumatic neurosis patients, right? He's also willing to make this universalist claim as well, right? And I love the fact that he's able to do that with certain ease. Okay, then he returns to the question of the life drives, and here he gives his wonderful footnote to Sabina Spearland's original article on death drive, even though he basically says it's very unclear to me and it's not that developed. It was still, I think, undeveloped in part because it was caught within libido theory largely. But it was obviously an important initial movement. So as it pertains to how the death drive conjugates with the life drives, we're getting into that now. So this occurs through the introduction of new quantities of stimuli. This accords well with the hypothesis that the life process of the individual leads for internal reasons to an equilibrium of chemical tensions. In essence, to death. Whereas, so that's one pole, which we have already seen. This is the inorganic state of matter and so on, death. Then the union with the living substance, and here we can tether with our biological friends, Weissman and those guys before, of a distinct individual increases these tensions and introduces new vital differences, as it were, which must then be lived out. So one would gather from glancing at this that vitalism is the great heroic feature of the new system, which we should pause and sort of think about other psychoanalytic commentators, namely Deleuze and Lacan, who want to make the claim that vitalism actually is the enemy in some sense, right? I think Deleuze will call vitalism superego in some sense. So that's something for us to flag, sort of, and I think somebody asked that question of sort of, what is vitalism for Freud? Okay. And then here's the famous Barbara Lowe Nirvana principle. Okay, so vitalism versus equilibrium is a kind of new distinction, right, between death drives and life drives as their sort of general biological functioning, right? A new sensitive issue, though. It is precisely for the sex drive that we're unable to demonstrate the characteristic of a repetition compulsion, the very characteristic that first led us to seek the death drives. So the two gametes in sexual reproduction in their life history are themselves only repetitions of the beginning of organic life. But the essential thing in the process of sexual life aims for is indeed the merging of two cell bodies. So what he's saying there, as I read it, is that there are drives which are not subordinated to inorganic materiality, i.e. to repetition compulsion. The eros, life, sex drives, whatever, right? They're all synonymous, right? It remains an ambiguity in some sense. Sort of what their status would be if the death drive did not insist upon them. Like, would we be Greek gods is the kind of notion that I'm wondering, you know? Seems to be sort of what he's saying in some sense. Yet the death drive is constitutive, so we cannot think their autonomy. We cannot think the life drives in fully autonomous way. Okay. Now, what does the Darwinian orientation have to tell us about the sex drives? And here, I think this is useful for those of you that wish to ask the relationship between Freud and Darwin. In somewhat of a dismissive way, Freud is basically saying, you know, look, this is not a helpful way to think of the drives. Pure and simple. I mean, you can see what it says there. Imagine in a sober Darwinian mode of thought, by supposing that the advantage of amphimixis, which I think is what does that mean? That's the unification of cellular life, right? The result at one time of the chance conjugation of two protoceta was retained and further exploited. Okay. In this view, sex would not be very old, and the extremely intense drive seeking to bring about sexual union would be repeating something that once occurred by chance and has since established itself as advantageous. So why is that uninteresting, I guess you could say? Or I guess it's uninteresting for the same reason that libido theory thought of the logic of the drives vis-a-vis narcissism. It's kind of a logic of sameness and identity, maybe, is one way to think about its inadequacy, let's say. Now, myth is now brought to bear. For our purposes, the aforementioned view of the Darwinian view of sexuality is of little use. It might be objected that it presupposes the existence of life drives. accordingly, if we do not desire to abandon our hypothesis of death drives, we must associate them from the very beginning with life drives, as I've said before. But it must be admitted that in that case, we're working on an equation with two unknowns. Science provides so little additional information on the origin of sexuality that the problem can be compared to a darkness into which not one ray of a hypothesis has penetrated. So I said here on the side, myth is invoked to resolve two things: the fact of the two unknowns of the drives and the strange inorganic material origin of the drives. So the beyond, or the fort, or the place from which Freud is recognizing this logic of repetition, right? Has an analog in Plato, right? And one thing that's interesting about his invocation of Plato here from the Symposium, where Aristophanes gives an account of the origin of sexuality, really, right? Two things I'll flag about it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I think you guys are familiar with it, and some of you may be. The human being is thought of as a double, as doppelganger in this account. And the second thing that's interesting is that Freud, in a kind of lazy way, makes the point that even Plato had this myth that he stole from the Vedas, the Upanishads, from Hinduism. So what he means by that is that its timeless status, is so generally compelling in some sense that it retains its kind of significance or its relevance for that reason. So yeah, you can see here this notion about doubling and so on. And the point is that there's a kind of a lost unity. So it's really a myth about the generation, not of the death drive, but of the sex drives, right? And so anyways, I think you can all take a look at that, and he gives a pretty long, that's where he mentions in the footnote here on Upanishads. And he's sort of now bringing it all together. And there's all this commentary that Derrida makes about who the status of the poet-philosopher is for Freud, and the way in which his own relationship to philosophy plays a role there, some of which is kind of interesting. I sort of found, I don't know what you all think, I'd love your thoughts on this, like what you thought of this notion of what he's grounding, what he's pulling from Plato, right? Obviously, we have Lacan's seminar on the transference, where he talks about the Symposium in great detail. And largely it's an analysis of Socrates' role as a transferential figure. But it's also a conversation on the role of love within analysis too, right? So I don't know if anyone's has read Lacan's seminar on the Symposium. Has anyone had a chance to look at this? Yeah. I know that, Raphael, you're a big fan of Plato.
Yes, but I haven't read the Lacan seminars, but I do find it odd that he mentions Aristophanes' myth and not Diotima's. It's weird, because I think the whole point of the Symposium is to pin down a difference between the notion of lack and excess, as if, well, that's how I read Aristophanes, as if he has a wrong notion of what the feeling of lack is, and then he only presents it as the lack that Deleuze and others like those will attack and say it's evil. But it's weird, because Plato's view is more of a matter of an excess. That's what the lack is, which seems closer to psychoanalysis or Lacan from the little I know. But
interesting.
It really surprised me that it's a bit lazy, like you said, because he he doesn't even have the trouble to. And it's weird because it's clearly not what Plato thought, but I guess.
Also, obviously, we know that Plato was so hostile to poets, but here
Yeah.
he's calling him a poet. It's a little silly. Yeah, it's well, even the master Freud can be a little unrigorous. He can be forgiven for his lack of rigor at times, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's not a criticism. It's just that it's weird because and it's something I think the end of the essays was really weird because I think in the part 7 it's like he puts a note and says this was all a dream. Like, please don't believe me. That's what I felt in the last couple of pages. But when he makes that Aristophanes quote, it's really weird because it seems like he's afraid to posit some sort of absolute, a plasma, a Schelling, some sort of Naturphilosophie. It's really weird.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, I agree. There's this sort of, I mean, I think there have been, I don't know if others have recommendations on this. I did put Adrian Johnston's dissertation on the Dropbox, and he gets into sort of modern biology in some level of detail, neuroscience and so on. So for those of you that have the time to examine his advancement or sort of taking, because he takes quite seriously the biological discourse and scientific apparatus in the formation of the hypothesis of the unconscious and death drive. So I highly recommend that text. But let us return here because now he is kind of bringing it home, so to speak. And he says, it would be reasonable to ask me whether and to what extent I am convinced of the hypotheses developed here, which is kind of an interesting thing to say for a founder of a discourse which calls itself scientific. It would be reasonable to ask me if I believe what I'm saying. And then he says, I do not know how far I believe in them. It seems to me that the affective factor of being convinced need not come into consideration at all here. One can surely dedicate oneself to a train of thought and follow it as far as it leads out of mere scientific curiosity. Or if one prefers, as an advocatus diaboli, who does not for all that sign a pact with the devil. Here again, the motif of the devil. I am fully aware that the third step in the theory of the drives, which I am taking here, cannot claim the same level of certainty as the earlier two. So that's a very interesting way to end the text or end this section. I mean, the ending of the text, the conclusion is a recapitulation, really. So we can visit it, but the last section is not developing much new stuff per se. And I made a note here that when you read the postcard by Derrida, really this is where all of Freud's vulnerabilities are laid to bear, as Raphael was just saying. And in particular, we must realize that it's not a small irony that Freud would banish people from the psychoanalytic community for proposing theories which he saw as the outcome of a self-analysis, right? As not adequately objective. But here he is dissecting his own proposals, kind of in the same way. You see there's a sort of a bit of a hypocrisy there, I would say. And then, I like this point. He says, but I wish that he would give us a clearer epistemological sense of how precisely he's using like biology and science. I think one of the things that Gabriel has really alerted me to is that for Lacanians, because Lacan had such a coherent theory of science, Lacanians have a tendency to sort of totalize a logic of science from their own discourse. Whereas the Freudian relationship to science compared to Lacan, I think, is a little bit different, like maybe for the better. So even though Freud's a little bit uneasy. He's a little bit naive in how he's using it. Very sketchy. At least he's giving science its due, or its sort of epistemic autonomy, we could say, as a possibility. Okay, so then we reach the concluding section, and in the concluding section, he's basically giving a kind of sequence of how he's arrived at his theory of the drives in this long footnote, which is worth reading. It's a nice summary, I think, of the whole sort of evolution of the terminology. He does make this important point, which many commentators have noted, which is that even though primary processes are unbound, excitations derive more pleasure. The move to binding them is still in service of pleasure principle. So in other words, I think this is super significant for us to retain that notion that primary processes possess this unbound incapacity to capture the excitations, but that even though he wants to make this dualism of life and death and all of that, I think he's leading a conclusion here, which is that the death drives are still adhering to the logic of the pleasure principle. So in other words, we should not think of them as the beyond. Like, there is a beyond, which cannot be mapped topographically. It's only thought in like time, right? But that's not the death drive. I think in case there was any confusion about that. And then here, this will be a nice segue to our conversation with Malibu. He makes the claim that the death drive is elastic. And so yes, and then he ends with this nice little piece of scripture, which is interesting, or this sort of poetic point, which again kind of goes back to the quasi-religious sensitivities, perhaps, that Freud is working with. Given that Freud was sort of an atheist rationalist Jew, it's interesting that he exhibits all of these sort of trepidations around demons, the devil, and so on. But I do like this notion of what one cannot fly to, one must limp to, is a nice notion of the pulsional drive, of the kind of very logic of death drive. And it kind of concludes the text with the idea that the crescendo of this text, the crescendo or the highest point of its production, probably came in the last section where he is introducing death drive, right? This is sort of the main contribution, as I read it. So that concludes the text. Any comments before we move on?
I was thinking in the sort of earlier part of chapter 6, I think it was, this sort of opposition of like internal death versus external death, kind of like Hegel-Spinoza opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Like Hegel thinking like death is inherent to the individual, while Spinoza seeing it as kind of a, as far as I know, like death as being an external, like a bad encounter.
Mm. So say more about this. I love this point.
Yeah, I guess I thought maybe Freud was thinking through that sort of impasse. Like, is death this external thing, or is it like internal or constitute to the individual? I think he ends up siding more along what Hegel would say, but I think he's legitimately kind of perplexed.
I mean, the possibility of it being a mere contingent kind of impingement is definitely held out in the example of the celiite or slipper infusorians, because there it is a matter of just the fact that their metabolic products end up adulterating waters in which they live. But in Woodruff's experiments, what you find is when he moved them to new bodies of water, they could continue to sustain themselves. Likewise, what you have in these early protozoic organisms is an ability to conjugate and rejuvenate. So yes, just to further that point, but this is also the question, I posed this in the Slack, I think this kind of touches on this topic, is there's the weird shift in between sections 4 and 5, where section 5 is of course about the imminent death, and the outstanding question there you could put along the lines of, okay, how does the organism end up becoming something that fends off its own death? Well, in section 4, he mentions, of course, the idea that the primitive organism has to mortify some portion of itself to create an insubstantial barrier. And it's the question there of whether this imminent death is the thing that accounts for that very creation of a barrier, that very, stealing it of itself. And so I'm not saying each side goes one way or another. I think he kind of more or less inclines towards an imminent model of death. But at every point, it is disrupting this distinction. I mean, this is kind of what gives Malibu's essay its force, is the fact that she really owns in on this.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we could almost like revisit your question, Lauren, when we get to an analysis of her reading here. Can you all see this slide? Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, so Catherine Malibu is an interesting figure. Are you aware of her work that she's done on neuronal plasticity? She's also somebody who's really taken kind of continental philosophy, psychoanalysis into contemporary science, in this case neuroscience, and has produced a short but very readable book on neuronal plasticity and like Hegel and Freud. And I've actually taken a class with her before. She's a very exceptionally good teacher as well. And I think you gathered from this short essay that she's really not messing around. I found it to be quite interesting. Both in the way that she is laying out the stakes of Beyond the Pleasure Principle as it pertains to the rest of philosophy and so on, in a very clear way, but also, yeah, like Aaron just mentioned, in pinpointing a problem that Freud does not adequately account for and may not even want to account for, which kind of goes back to Laurent's question around immanence versus the individual. So let's analyze this text. I put it together in these slide format just to make it a little bit more readable for you. So she opens by basically asking the question, which is, what is it that threatens the pleasure principle, right? And as a philosopher, she's very interested in whether the mastery of the pleasure principle, right? To what extent, and we think again of the shield and of the barrier and of all of this kind of the question of the beyond as demonic, the question of the beyond as that which we do not want to, like, there's also a sort of humility in Freud, right? Which is, I'm discovering these things, but I don't really want to. In some sense, it's almost like a Catholic saint. Like I have these or a superhero. I have these, I've discovered something which is, I don't really want to be the prophet of, right?
Cantor in set theory, he sent
exactly.
to the church. I'm afraid of what I've stumbled on here.
Yeah, he writes a letter to the Pope, like, look, I just killed God. I can't stand myself, but but then he tries to make a way around it, but he knows that he can't. And it's like,
Lacan has a similar thing. At one point, one seminar, he's like, Freud started us on this and we got nowhere else to go than forward, sigh.
Right. I love that whole thing. It's the persistence of the theological in thought, I suppose. Okay. All right. So the big thing that Malibu will say is that because what the compulsion to repeat shows us, like what is it actually? Well, it's an insight on time. It's an insight on temporality. And it is an insight on an origin, which, we can pinpoint in dreams, we can pinpoint in traumatic neuroses, and we can pinpoint in everyday things like children's play. And we also can pinpoint it vis-a-vis a psychopathology of everyday life, which is like, do we ever forget? Does the unconscious, like, you know what I mean? Like there's this, this point of a destiny of a return. And we saw this also with his theory on fate and destiny as well. Okay. But then she asks the question, if what goes beyond always tends to come back, like, always comes, never fully disintegrates, but has a return. And if this is an insight apropos time. And she calls this the time of materiality. And what that means is that it is material because it is composed of an inorganic status. So it's not organic time. That's important. And she asks a question which I think is quite nice, which is it prior to the time of pleasure? Or is it after the time of pleasure? That's an interesting point. And what is the drive in this form of time composed of? And this is at the very moment when Freud defines the plasticity of mental life as a coexistence of life and death, and as an undecidable state between life and death, he introduces a distinction between plasticity and elasticity, which breaches this undecidability or this coexistence. So similar to Derrida's reading, she is pinpointing a kind of point of difference, a point of undecidability of Freud's antinomies, which is one that many people have not picked up on. So what is the difference between plasticity and elasticity? So I've kind of schemed this out for you all. So plasticity is obviously much more interesting than elasticity, right? In what sense? I mean, first of all, she says that Freud had a theory of the libido as a kind of plasticity, but why does he not extend that theory to the death drive? Why does the death drive not possess form? Plasticity possesses form. It's able to take on other forms, right? It has a possibility to forge. So you can think plasticity as creation and destruction, right? And you can also think of it as that which latches, as that which cathects, and so on. So
idea of libido.
Yeah, like, that's right. So I guess the question is why, and this is maybe a dumb question, but I think nonetheless a good one, which is why is the composition of death drive not retain the same plasticity? I think that's what she's asking, right? Because the sex drives do have it, right? They conjugate, they're forming, right? They have that kind of status. So, okay. To me, this is interesting in the sense that I link her argument here around the distinction between elasticity and plasticity back to a problem of the mythical status of the drive, of the death drive. And I wonder if you might agree. Might Freud not need these accounts with a plastic account of the death drive in order to get beyond a mythical account of of the death drive. She says, quote, there would thus be something more primitive, more elementary than the pleasure principle, which would shake its mastery. The time of materiality would be prior to the time of pleasure. So I don't know, I don't know what you make of it. I think another thing that's really worth putting up there is this long quote, which I put onto Twitter, and some of you may have seen it, but I just want to actually insert it for you very quickly, because it's an incredible account, actually playing Freud off of Heidegger. Let me put it up there for you. Okay. So it's a bit of a longer quote, but I think it's worth us reading it. I'll just read it out loud. She says, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud articulates the first, and to my knowledge, a unique concept of time in all Western thought, in which the very notions of origin and temporality of the soul, temporality of existence, life, and death themselves would be derived only from this primitive material time.
They skip the line.
Say again?
You skipped the line. Origin and end of past, present.
Oh, sorry, my screen was off. I apologize. Do you want to read it out loud? If you can see it, please read it.
Okay. Starting from the beginning, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud articulates the first, and to my knowledge, a unique concept of time in all Western thought, in which the very notions of origin and end, of past, present, and future are merely referred to inorganic matter. The temporality of the soul, the temporality of finitude, the temporality of existence, life, and death themselves would be derived only from this primitive material time. They would definitely be secondary. What goes beyond and what comes back through to the compulsion to repeat is not the threat of death, not the image of endangered life, not the situation of a being toward death faced with her fragility. Such situations are not irreducible to pleasure. Freud would certainly have considered that the existential analysis developed in Being and Time would perhaps be able to supersede metaphysics but not pleasure. What goes beyond the pleasure principle as the originary temporality is not the temporality of Dasein, but the pure neutrality of inorganic matter. By pure neutrality, I mean a state of being which is neither life nor death, but their very similarity.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm struck by a couple of things with this passage. One is the fact that we have a clear account as to the beforeness and the afterwardness, and their strange coincidence is now rendered clear. Yet we also are left open, kind of gapingly open in some sense, wondering what the hell this space is in fact. So we have a question about its ontological status, right? And we can see its speculative hypothesis pretty well, given Freud's proofs of, and he provides these various proofs right throughout the text. I like it also because of the conversation with Heidegger. I wonder what you all think about that. I don't know if there's many Heideggerian people in this meeting, but it's interesting to me because it also stresses the inorganic materiality, which is this sort of, I see the stark neutralism of the theory in some sense, right? It's like literally like staking out some fundamentally new conception of how life and death touch this other realm. Like it's literally an other realm, right? But all of that is a sort of precursor to her real question, which is sort of what is the composition of the materiality from this space, right? And why does Freud insist on its elastic nature? Right? So that's what I like about this passage. I invite others to.
So I had 2 points to raise. One is this idea, and that Libido stresses towards the beginning of her article, I think it's on the first page, in fact, that, I mean, at stake here in the material time, inorganic time, is something, she doesn't use these exact words, but something we could call before the beginning, before the before, maybe, or just before the beginning. I don't know, that's I want to say it's a kind of impossible in itself in that way.
Mm.
It is again, these aren't her exact words, but it's something she refers to along the lines of the immaterial on the cusp of life, not yet organic.
Yeah.
But just being there, how do you get to this impossible moment? I wonder if the reference to a time of simple materiality, moreover, doesn't undermine the fact that precisely what this essay is doing, I think, or at least this is one of these speculative, kind of vectors have been taught by the text. And I mentioned Zupanchik's lines to this effect last week, is that this is a text that makes us think of the immaterial, the material, the inorganic, as not identical with itself. In fact, Lacan, in the section from Seminar 5 that you recommended we read, he towards the thing, towards the end of the thing on a child is being beaten, he's mostly citing the economic problem of masochism. And he says, to the effect here that, who's to say we ever reach this kind of zero level of tension. We know that in nature, yes, now there's no reason to think that this pain stops at living beings, according to everything we know about a nature that is much more animated, rotting, fermenting, bubbling, and even explosive than we have been able to imagine till now. So does this holding aloft of just the time of simple materiality not potentially undermine the very fact that the material is not consistent with itself? Is this not itself an elevation of origins, even as it's being also linked to ends here?
Yeah, well, I feel like the Slovene school would want to make that claim, right? That like they want to accept that, and they'll bring in a lot of Hegel to further elucidate that, but I think they wish to retain that thesis. I think Malibu is saying something different. She says, quote, if we are not able to prove that the destruction of form has and is a form, if form is always and only on the side of eros and of pleasure, it therefore becomes impossible to prove that there is anything beyond the pleasure principle. I think that hits it right there, which is, to be vulgar, she's basically saying like, how do we think of this relationality through death drive of the inorganic material, right? Without form, it leaves us in a mystical abyss. It leaves us in the kind of, I don't know, Schellingian interminable space, if you wish,
Are there not things that can lack form, though? Can there be, at one point she says the only thing that's imperishable here is form and not the absence of form. And I'm wondering if there's not a perhaps Lacanian response to this, if there's not something in Lacan that is precisely that which doesn't quite have form. It takes forms.
What she says here, and this goes to Lorenz's point as well, I didn't put this in the slides, but I think this is important to note. Where plasticity does emerge is for individuals. Freud says something very interesting, which is that like this universal elastic dimension of death drive and its logic is universal for all subjects. Yet some drives have a refined plasticity through individual, like there's a degree of psychic plasticity that's individually endowed or something like this. And maybe you could account for it through a number of different ways, right? So he sort of ends with plasticity qua individual, elasticity qua generic or universal in some sense. She says, a mysterious natural elasticity contaminates the plasticity of life. A mysterious natural elasticity contaminates the plasticity of life. And then here's the distinctions between these again. So that's very interesting, right? I really like this distinction. I think it's a very productive one.
Directly to respond to Aaron's question, because I've kind of been thinking about this for a few weeks now. I'm wondering if how much we could maybe read the inorganic, like not as like matter, as like the Big Bang or whatever, like the stuff before subjectivity, but especially in the Lacanian register she mentions, what if we read the inorganic as like the signifier, and then the symbolic being that sort of generic realm of elasticity that then only takes like a plastic form within the imaginary of a subject?
I can't answer that in full, but there is on Kopchak's reading in Cutting Up, in Read My Desire, she really makes a lot of the claim of elasticity. She, in fact, this is the kind of point at which Freud completely turns Bergson on his head, where elasticity for Bergson is complete novelty and nothing but a forward progress of time. Elasticity, and she's working off of course, a very Lacanian reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Elasticity is precisely a mechanism of language. It's the fact that things don't move just progressively forward in the symbolic. Things can be erased. Things can be retroactively destroyed, nullified. And also you have the opening onto repetition, precisely the very thing that Bergson would foreclose. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have much more of an adequate answer for that. That's going to take me.
I think you make a great point. I mean, Kate, I think that's a very good proposition. But I'm kind of wanting to remain with Freud. I'm analyzing Freud qua Freud. I'm not analyzing Freud with Lacan, right? I'm just trying to derive for Freud and for his problems. He could have quite easily, you see, because he talks about libido theory as we reviewed, right, and how it's inadequate and so on. And then he's introducing this elastic demonic force, right? When it's maybe, I don't know, is it necessary to think of it that way? Is my question for him. I don't know.
I guess part of what I'm wondering is if he addresses at all the genesis of the unbounded energy, because and this is still going to a little bit of the Lacanian register. I feel like there's something of an answer to that if you think about signifying circuits sort of producing an unbounded energy that can then get binded on the individual level, which would produce, I guess, more of a plasticity.
Some of this may be addressed when we turn to Deleuze in a moment. I have this, some of this may be addressed. So hold that thought.
Can I pose a few questions before moving on?
Yeah.
These were things that I was thinking before we entered Malibu, and unfortunately I wasn't able to read her text today, but I think the discussion and what you talked about, I think it brings back the subject. But at the end of the essay, it was really weird because at the same time you get the feeling that the pleasure principle is linked to the erotic drives. And then in the end, he says that the death drive is actually linked to the pleasure principle, since the pleasure is always moving towards death when it reaches its maximal stage of discharging of energy and so on. And what I was thinking from the end is, if we shouldn't think that beyond the pleasure principle, this may be stupid, but if beyond the pleasure principle, this other principle would be linked to the erotic drives, in the sense that I think this was what I was trying to get at last week, and unfortunately I couldn't put it on Slack, but my feeling is that it's the erotic drives that actually make the death drive something that cannot fulfill itself. So in a sense, it is something that suspends or limits or impedes the pleasure principle from fulfilling itself completely. And the weird thing is, well, Freud, in the sixth section, and this is what I found hard to understand, he definitely needs to find the genesis of the erotic. And then he tries to say that it has to be simultaneous to the death drive. He looks for it in biology, and then he messes around, and he can't find it. He posits the wacky Aristophanes and the Naturphilosophie theory. And what's weird to me is that, in a sense, and I think this comes back to the question of forms that you were all discussing, is that it seems that the form that is preserved is the repetition itself, the possibility of repetition. Maybe I'm being a bit, my delusion roots are.
But wait, but does the eros, life drives, sex drives, the three are kind of synonymous, right? Do they have the same logic of repetition?
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. It's because it seems that it's a repetition, but a repetition that does not entail pleasure. It does seem to make sense in a way, because
I actually think Freud is sort of tripping over himself, because introducing something that's pre-constitutive to the heroic life drives.
Yes.
There's something insists on them, right? That adheres to a different logic of repetition than the ones that they adhere to, right?
Yes.
So the supremacy, their supremacy is therefore taken down a few notches. But you're saying that, what are you saying exactly? Are you saying that
it's all scattered over here, but what I'm saying is it seems that since the pleasure principle is linked to the death drive, and I'm just trying to diagram it, since it's linked to the death drive, it can't be linked to the erotic drive. And I get that's the position he's starting from, but it looks like in the essay, and I think he's scared. During the whole essay, it seems he's scared of what he's thinking, because maybe he's not used to speculative thought. But what I feel is that, well, since the pleasure principle is linked to the death drive, the realization of the pleasure, the discharge, it needs, so it can't complete itself, so it can delay the fulfillment. It needs something that stops it, that deters it. But the problem is that it always needs a determinant. Something that will stop it needs to be always in place from the very beginning. And that's why I'm trying to link it to the weird repetition, because in the end, he tries to find out where exactly is the genesis of the erotic, that it can't be after death, it can't be before death, it has to be simultaneous. And I'm thinking, because if the death drive is prior, if this repetition of trying to fulfill the life, fulfill your death, or and the pleasure is that movement toward the fulfillment of the static, the linking up and the discharge. In a sense, it seems that what allows that, at least in a logical sense, what allows the death drive to exist is a different kind of repetition, which would be the empty repetition of the death drive itself, as if the erotic drive was another kind of repetition, because it has no object except the repetition of the death drive, which is the pleasure principle.
Yeah, I mean, Freud says in The Economic Problem of Masochism that the task of the libido is to make the destructive drive or the death drive harmless, right? Mm-hmm. So, and you really get that a lot in Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. Like, can we think of a configuration of social harmony, right, that would deprivilege the persistence of this, right? Like, which is such a fundamentally different reading than the Lacanian field of the status of the relationship between the social and the pleasure, and you know what I mean. So I kind of feel like what you're getting at in some sense reminds me a little bit of what Herbert Marcuse was doing, a little, honestly, insofar as you wish to make the claim that maybe death drive is not as constitutive as we like to think. I don't know.
No, I do think it's constitutive, but I think it needs because I think that's the problem. He needs the dual. It needs to be on equal plane.
Yeah.
So I think that's why it's weird. But the weird thing is,
Marcuse makes the claim that like actually the task of communist socialist life is to create the conditions for it to be kept at bay. You see, like. And then that's why for him, he's kind of grounding it in this kind of natural, not in language, right? It's a different grounding of the whole theory of the drives for him. So I think there's a lot of different directions you could take this, to be honest.
I mean, at bottom, when you say it's addressing the fact that death drive is, in a sense, for Freud, you could describe it as essentially parasitic.
Oh yeah, I think so too. I think that's a perfect term to describe it. Yeah. It's definitely like a related also to the uncanny, as like the visitor which you don't wish to have at your home that resides there nonetheless. Like the fly that it's the gadfly. It's like why I love this notion of Socrates as gadfly. Because gadfly is the fly that the horse cannot swat, can't reach it. Like, in other words, it's the one that the state cannot capture. So yeah, like I think maybe there is an ambivalence at this in Beyond the Pleasure Principle about the insistence, the stickiness of death drive. You know what I mean?
I guess just because I thought that Aaron said was excellent, the parasitic nature, because it's really weird because it seems like at the same time we live for pleasure in a sense. Well, I would like to live for pleasure if capitalism allowed me to do it, but what's weird is that in a sense the death drive is the motor. And I agree that it's a parasite to the living drive because it cannot fulfill itself alone. It needs the delay and everything else. But the weird thing is that it seems like and I'm in no sense using this term in a technical sense, but it seems that the repetition of the life drive is the empty it's like like the enjoyment of the repetition as some transcendental capacity that's turning on itself independent of what the object is. But it's weird because in a sense we live for the death drive, not for the life drive, because it is the pleasure principle. I'm trying to take it seriously that the life drive, at least in the end of the essay, it cannot, because he doesn't conclude saying that, well, the life drive is linked also to he ends up saying, well, this is weird because the death drive is linked to the pleasure principle, and that leaves us in a crazy situation. So yeah. I'm trying to think through the fact that the other repetition is linked to the erotic drive, but it's an objectless repetition. And that's why it's weird, because there's no pleasure involved.
Yes. Yes.
The very idea of objectless repetition, I mean, this is Freud in the 3 essays. You know, this is how the drive starts out, is the fact that it has some object it leans on. Anlehnen, I think, is the German. In Strachey's singular way of translating this is anaclesis. Yes. It leans on an object initially, but then it totally detaches from it. It finds some surplus pleasure along the route there and then deviates.
Yeah.
And the other half is negativity. It has to give body to some negativity at the same time, or at least on the Lacanian account.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was just thinking to circle back to Cade's comment about the signifier of inorganic materiality, if this is a logic of the origin of signifier. To be honest with you, I wonder if in the Lacanian conceptual apparatus or conceptual repertoire, I wonder actually if the Das Ding is a better way to think that linkage to inorganic materiality. Even though Lacan will abandon the Das Ding and replace it with Objet later, I feel like that might have a better connectivity to why, because you know, signifier still is around a fundamental relationship to signification, right? And the phallus determines the order of signification, right? And so really, if you wish to say that the signifier, you really have to go before that, which is the phallic object, right? So I'm actually wondering if it's Das Ding as the monstrous other, as that which is beyond maternal desire. Just as a thought, Kate, I don't know if that resonates with you.
Thinking about that a little bit, like on an individual like genesis, I get where the chronology of like the phallus and the symbolic order doesn't work as a prior sort of thing, but I guess like contrary to Malibu, I'm still seeing maybe a necessity in reading it as a myth, but like a material myth with Freud, and it being as if this like mythic inorganic matter beforehand. But yeah, I see where that would seem to be a contradiction, at least on the level of like the origin of the individual subject. As far as Das Ding goes, I guess, and this is just maybe even a technical question, a lot of times I imagine Das Ding is something like a Freddy Krueger sort of thing, or like an It the Clown sort of thing. And I was wondering if you would consider that more an elastic figure or a plastic figure.
So I don't know, like, I mean, this kind of brings us to Deleuze to some extent, because, you know, part of the task of the life drives, of the sex drive, is also the task of sublimation. And sublimation is a kind of perfect example of plasticity in some sense. And so when you are sublimating, you're operating with the region of psychic life known that Lacan would call, or Freud would call, the thingly dimension in the other. So it's like an opaque dimension in the other, which is non-representable in some sense. And so I like that notion that it corresponds to the inorganic materiality precisely because of its non-representational status. Whereas signifier is kind of, you know, origin of representation in some sense. So, yeah, anyways, it's just something to think about. I don't think I have any precise, or anybody has any precise answers, which is fine. Do you guys mind if we go to the Deleuze section now? Is that okay, just for time purposes? Unless there's any other points, and we have 15 minutes left. I think this should be enough time. So Deleuze says in his essay, Coldness and Cruelty, on sadomasochism, it's an interesting book. You know, he has 2 chapters on Freud, right? And he really holds the same line, you know, that Malibu holds around this notion that really there are no exceptions to the pleasure principle. But he calls it a second order principle. And that the higher principle Freud leaves unanswered, which I found interesting. And and he says that since pleasure is founded in unbound states, that means it is not itself the highest principle. The highest principle is somehow found in this beyond. So that's a really interesting kind of I don't know if you want to say inversion, right? Because it's a kind of unsaid principle that's governing it. Yet he takes to task the system that Freud develops, and he formalizes it. And he says, look, similar to what Malibu says, look, if you take seriously what Freud is really talking about here, you can derive a clear schema of the operation of temporality from the text. And here's how he breaks it down. So you have a kind of state of, well, first of all, each of these 3 moments, before, during, and after, should be thought of as the result of simultaneity. So in other words, in order for an experience to be of the simultaneous, it's composed of these three types of syntheses. So that's number one. And they're governed by logics of repetition. But you see the dashes there, these kind of dash, like groundlessness, repetition that binds, repetition that unbinds. These antinomies, right? These dualisms also drive each point. So it's a kind of nice formulation. You might also think about it like this visually. And the thing that he really picks up on here is the point that Freud wishes to make, is that at the point of the after, right, where if the logic of the pleasure principle is coherent, he says it's reliant on a pass, on a notion of diffusion, or on a notion of a successful or an unsuccessful transference as the kind of possibility of the after. So in some sense, the during and the before are fixed, but the after is sort of in question, is what he says. And he notes that for Freud, why it is transcendental is precisely because the precondition of the before is groundless. And I've mentioned this before, that's kind of a sine qua non of what Lowe sees as the strength of Beyond the Pleasure principle, is that the whole thing is formed on a groundless abyss. So I understand the groundless abyss, I wonder if you agree, sort of as what Malibu calls inorganic materiality, right? As this kind of monistic sort of thing, right? That which is before excitation, right? So I found that this is a kind of interesting framework. And then okay, well, what happens when the framework is disrupted? And he says that its disruption occurs in the linkage between sadism and masochism. And this is a nice quote, I'll just read this. And this is really interesting, I think, for the logic of how we understand. Remember when Freud first introduces death drive, he says this whole notion of, he doesn't say sexualization versus desexualization, but he does make a point of non-libidinal drive. That's the demonic, right? That's the death drive, right? So Deleuze is interested in the way in which there's a dialectic of the sadistic non or desexualized that then becomes resexualized in masochism. And that's like exactly sort of in some sense what masochism is. It's a return of desexualized force resexualized. And if you think of the image of the kind of, I don't know, in your head, you have an image of a masochist, that's a pretty good definition of what a masochistic agent is, if you know what I mean. So he says, instead of repetition being experienced as a form of behavior related to a pleasure already obtained or anticipated, instead of repetition being governed by the idea of experiencing or re-experiencing pleasure, repetition runs wild and becomes independent of all previous pleasure. It has itself become an idea or ideal. Pleasure is now a form of behavior related to repetition, accompanying and following repetition, which has itself become an awesome independent force. So somebody asked the question about unbound, this is it. Can unbound pleasure retain its principal status? And he says that it can. Pleasure and repetition have thus exchanged roles as a consequence of the instantaneous sleep, that is to say, of the twofold process of desexualization and resexualization. So think of that. Remember when Freud says sadism is in the object drive, masochism is the introjection of that back into the ego. This is sort of what he's playing with here. So in sadomasochism, Eros is desexualized and humiliated for the sake of a resexualized death drive, or thanatos. There is no mysterious link between pain and pleasure. The mystery lies in the desexualization process, which consolidates repetition at the opposite pole to pleasure. and in the subsequent resexualization, which makes the pleasure of repetition seemingly proceed from pain. In sadism, no less than in masochism, there is no direct relation to pain. Pain should be regarded as an effect only. So I think you see a lot of themes here with Lacan's discussion of the Marquis de Sade avec Kant, around the way in which the type of society that the Marquis de Sade was envisioning could also adhere to a structured logic of Kantian reason. Like that could be quite easily superimposed, and you swap out pleasure with reason, so to speak. The other thing that Deleuze will note here that's really interesting, if you go back to this third point of repetition that erases or repetition that destroys, he gives you 3 points of the repetition at the end of the after. It can function through idealization, it can function through identification, or it can function through perversion. I thought that was a really, and here he's not elaborating his own method with Guattari that he does in Anti-Oedipus, right? Where he really goes into a lot more detail about the way in which these conjugations and diffusions and so on can happen, right? But he's saying this is for Freud, right? He's reading Freud directly. So I think it's a really useful way to link the outcome of the temporal process of the death drive. You see my point? And the way in which that diffusion actually links to ego, superego, and ultimately to third as id. You see it? That's fair. I think this is why I say this is a very clear book, essay by Deleuze. And then I finally have made some distinctions on masochism for Lacan and Deleuze. You know, Lacan has some interesting things to say about masochism, and he really, you remember this whole thing with the Fort Da and the child? Remember how the real, not like the real, but the real, R-E-E-L, like the object, which he calls the objet A, the toy itself, that the child used to fling the other objects. So he says that the masochist uses like a reel, which is like the chain or the whip. Like the objet A for the masochist is the one that exhibits pain back onto the ego, back onto the self, right? But then he says something interesting, which is why. And we'll also remember that the moment of the spalting, the splitting of the subject in the example of the Fort Da of primordial repression, right? The game was a game of mastery to avoid, or to cope with, to handle, to master that erasure, right? So what's repeated in masochism is that sense in which there remains a continuously unfulfilled unwantedness at the point of the subject's erasure, right? And instead of the father functioning as an introduction to the signifying chain, the object itself, the object of pain, stands in as the father, right? And then Lacan makes an interesting final point, which is that most masochistic patients are also suicidal, right? Because they're standing before the precipice of the introduction to signification, and they've internalized a kind of refusal and a repetition of that refusal through self-harm. So that's kind of some stuff for Lacan that's kind of interesting. And then for Deleuze, I think we've seen this already about resexualization. And the mystery lies in the desexualization process, which consolidates repetition at the opposite pole to pleasure. So I guess the point is that the example of the sadomasochistic experience for Deleuze is not an exception to the same it's like the inverse of the same repetition logic for a pleasurable scenario. in some sense, which is very similar to Lacan's point, I think, about the Marquis de Sade. So anyways, I thought those were some interesting little commentaries. Yeah, I'll end it with that, unless anybody has any questions or anything like that.
A few regarding Lacan's reading of A Child is Being Beaten. This is, I mean, I can get the sense how the wit functions as object, especially insofar as Darian Leader really stresses this. He has a great essay on this topic in the Sikh Sexuation volume, insofar as it's really, it's an oral, like sound implement. I mean, it makes a crack, it makes a whip, it makes a sound, which really, I mean, it's kind of naturally the very index of the symbolic function for this reason. He also draws all these links in languages, figures of speech that, well, link speech to a kind of primordial violence. I guess it's just, I don't know, I'm curious about this relation. So on the one hand, you have the whip, which is both an index of the symbolic father, name of the father. It's both object A, object A. And then also, I know some other readings of this incorporate the gaze into this fantasy. I was reading something a while ago by Colette Soler, making the, well, you know, French Lacanians, they can be kind of heteronormative, let's say.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I mean, the book is it's sexual ambiguities. It's illuminating. It's clearly written. It clarifies some things. It just yeah. I don't disagree with everything she has to say, regardless. Needless to say, but yeah, she ties in this element, and moreover, Leader stresses the idea of. I mean, you'll find this among. Women patients, etc., is, they're frequently asked, where are you in the fantasy? I'm looking on. And he takes this as an instance of, kind of the feminine exception, feminine jouissance, outside of phallic. Well, not, see, I never can get this very clear if you could describe it as falling quite outside the phallic function, or how the right vocabulary here.
Yeah, well, in the seminar 5 on the formations of the unconscious, Lacan will make a point reminding us that on feminine masochism that Freud develops. And I really saw a lot of precursors to what Lacan will eventually develop in feminine jouissance, which is all about the difference for the masochistic female in their relationship to the logic of the phallus. So that's a huge connection there. And yeah, I think I think Deleuze's reading in Coldness and Cruelty is so good because he's confining Freud's system and saying almost like it is a game which has these outcomes, and like, you know what I mean? Like he's sort of narrowing the reading. Because he's such a good speculative philosopher, he's able to take all of Freud's trepidations with speculation and kind of bring them home. It's such a nice read. If you haven't looked at those 2 chapters, I think it's probably one of the best commentaries of Freud I've ever read.
Yeah, I need to. I first actually came across it in high school, and even then it made a lot of sense.
You read Deleuze in high school?
I was way in over my head. I had a copy of Difference in Repetition as a junior. Never give a high schooler Deleuze. It's going to destroy their brains. But it really is Deleuze at some of his clearest. I'm looking forward to reading it, because I do a lot of a lot of the stuff I'm writing a whole long thing on A Child is Being Beaten right now. So
very cool. Very good for you. Well, what do other people think? Are there other thoughts or interventions since we're reaching our time? On anything, really.
This is more like even a question into the void a little bit, if anybody has an answer, because since we're talking difference and repetition somewhat, I know there's a certain relation between the repetition compulsion and then the eternal return in difference and repetition in Deleuze's reading of it. And I just don't know if anybody has any track on that, because there seems to be like a confluence, but also a strong disjointedness. I think even one of the translations, like eternal return of the same, was kind of used even, I think, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in one of the translations or something close to it.
Yeah.
So if anybody even has any suggestions for secondary reading on how to really parse that in Deleuze's interpretation, much appreciated.
I mean, if you want to look at Deleuze vis-a-vis Freud, you should read Aaron Schuster's new book, The Trouble with Pleasure, because that's literally like what it sets out to do. And these three syntheses that I shared with you of the death instinct, because he's so fond of the three syntheses, he'll expand them and give it a wider account, Deleuze will, of habit, memory, and link those three, habit, memory, and death instinct, to a wider idea of the Freudian unconscious on the one hand. On the other hand, he is arguing that Freud has a kind of individualized conception of repetition compulsion. And Deleuze will seek to posit a kind of more universal substrate or logic of it as well, to summarize. So he takes all of that a lot farther than Freud did. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, Difference in Repetition is an incredible book for that reason. But the important thing Schuster points out is that all of, Deleuze's Kantianism, the novelty of it, right, is made possible by Freud, right? Like Freud allows him to make these innovations in many ways, So I don't think we should lose sight of that. But maybe we need to do a reading group on Difference in Repetition, my friend. That might be a good thing to do.
I would be game. Be the second time going around. Last one didn't finish, but willing to repeat that.
Word. Okay, great. Well, yeah, so we're super stoked to meet again next Thursday. I'm going to send readings. All of us learn so much with Gabriel. And so I think, we're in for a treat next Thursday. Unless there's any other questions, I don't want to keep folks, for too much longer. One question how many people are in Australia? Lauren, you're in Australia? How is it
I'm
out
in
there?
Australia.
Oh, yes. Hi, Annie.
Hi. What was the question? How is it?
Oh, I have to put my recording on stop in order to ask this question.